The Forgotten Code. Chapter 1. The Message. Jack Reacher walked through the narrow streets of a small Texas town, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way past weather-beaten buildings. It was the kind of place people drove through without a second thought. Reacher liked it that way, quiet, unassuming, a town barely on the map, just how he preferred things. No obligations, no ties. Just him, his thoughts, and the open road. He pushed open the door to a dingy diner, the bell above jingling in a half-hearted chime. The air inside was thick with the smell of bacon grease and old coffee. A few locals glanced his way but quickly returned to their conversations. Reacher didn't stand out much, at least not here. He walked to the counter, ordered a black coffee, and found a booth near the window. The coffee arrived quickly, dark and bitter, just how he liked it. He sat back, allowing himself a rare moment of stillness. Outside, the sun beat down on the dusty street, casting long shadows as the day dragged into the late afternoon. Then, his phone vibrated. Reacher frowned. He didn't get many calls, and fewer still knew the number to his disposable phone. He pulled it out of his pocket, expecting a wrong number or maybe an automated message. But the text on the screen made him sit up straighter. In danger. Code 21984. Remember Frankfurt? Burns. Reacher hadn't thought of that name in years. John Burns had been a fellow MP, back in the days when Reacher wore a uniform and the world made a bit more sense. Burns was reliable, solid, one of the few people Reacher trusted on those missions. If Burns was reaching out now, something was seriously wrong. Reacher took another sip of coffee, his mind already shifting gears. Code 21984. It was familiar, something from a distant part of his past. And Frankfurt, that word hit like a hammer, dragging up memories of a mission that had gone sideways years ago. There were still pieces of that operation that didn't sit right with him. Things left unresolved. Why now? Reacher hadn't heard from Burns in years, not since they both left the military. If Burns was using code, it wasn't just trouble. It was life or death. He stared at the phone for a moment, then set it down on the table. He could ignore it, keep moving like he always did. But that wasn't Reacher's style. When someone from his past called for help, he listened. And when it came to a cryptic message like this, it meant the problem was deep, very deep. He pulled out a small notebook from his bag, something he'd carried with him for years, filled with bits of information that might one day matter again. He flipped through it until he found a name. Burns, J. There were no numbers listed, just dates and places, Frankfurt being one of them. The coffee had gone cold by the time Reacher finished the cup. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked out the window. The sun was low now, the shadows longer, the town settling into its evening quiet. But inside Reacher's mind, the gears were turning, calculating. Code 21984. He hadn't thought about it in years, but now it was all coming back. It was part of a series of protocols they used during an op overseas, a safety net in case things went wrong. And Frankfurt, that city had been the backdrop to something big, something that didn't sit right with him back then. Something that had just resurfaced. Reacher stood, tossed a few bills on the table, and walked out into the cooling air. If Burns was in trouble, there was no time to waste. He needed to track him down, fast. And to do that, he needed to follow the trail back to where it all began. Frankfurt. Whatever was waiting for him there, Reacher knew it wouldn't be easy. But then again, nothing worth doing ever was. Are you hooked yet? Subscribe and share to follow Jack Reacher as he uncovers the dark secrets behind the Forgotten Code. Chapter 2. The trail begins. The Texas air had cooled by the time Jack Reacher made his way out of town, the vast open road stretching out before him. He didn't know where Burns was exactly, but he had a starting point, Frankfurt. Reacher wasn't the type to jump into things without a plan, but time wasn't a luxury he had. Not if Burns was in the kind of danger Reacher suspected. The code, 21984, gnawed at him. It was more than just a string of numbers. It was a signal, an alarm from the past. As Reacher walked through the deserted streets, he played back the years in his mind. Frankfurt had been the site of a covert operation, a mission that involved layers of intelligence, secrecy, and dirty politics. Back then, Reacher had been a cog in a much larger machine. Burns had been another. But something had gone wrong on that mission. Something Reacher never fully understood. And now, years later, that shadow was reaching out to pull him back in. Reacher's mind raced. 3 men, all armed, and nowhere to run. The odds weren't in their favor, but Reacher had faced worse. His eyes flicked to Burns, who stood frozen beside him, fear etched across his face. "You're making a mistake," Reacher said, his voice steady. "You think killing us will solve your problem, but it won't. People are already looking into this. You're just delaying the inevitable." The man smiled, a cold, calculated expression. "That's where you're wrong, Reacher. No one's looking into anything. By the time we're finished here, you too will be ghosts, just another footnote in a forgotten operation." Reacher's jaw tightened. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. These men were here to finish the job, and they weren't going to leave without doing it. But Reacher wasn't going down without a fight. Without warning, Reacher moved. In a blur of motion, he lunged toward the first man, disarming him with a swift strike to the wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, and Reacher followed with a powerful blow to the man's throat, sending him crashing to the forest floor. The second man reacted quickly, raising his weapon, but Reacher was already moving. He dodged the shot, closing the distance in seconds, delivering a bone-crushing punch to the man's jaw. The man went down hard, his gun falling from his grasp. The leader, now alone, drew his weapon, aiming it directly at Reacher. But before he could fire, Burns, with a surge of adrenaline, tackled him from behind, knocking him off balance. The gun went off, the shot echoing through the trees, but it missed its mark. Reacher was on him in an instant, disarming him and pinning him to the ground. The man struggled, but Reacher's strength was overpowering. "You've lost," Reacher growled, his grip tightening around the man's collar. "It's over." The man spat, his face twisted in anger. "You think you've won? You don't even know who you're up against. This goes higher than you can imagine." Reacher didn't flinch. "Maybe. But you're done." He knocked the man out cold, leaving him unconscious on the ground. The forest was silent once again, the danger momentarily past. Reacher stood, breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the darkness for any more threats. Burns staggered to his feet, his chest heaving with the weight of what had just happened. Is it over?" Reacher shook his head. "Not yet. But this was just a small part of it. There's more out there, and we need to make sure the truth comes out." Burns nodded, the fear in his eyes slowly giving way to determination. "We'll expose them, Reacher. We have to." Reacher glanced down at the unconscious men at their feet. The shadows that had been chasing them for so long were finally starting to lift. But the fight wasn't over, not yet. Burns had stumbled onto something far bigger than either of them had realized, and now it was up to them to finish what they'd started. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Reacher knew one thing for sure. They weren't done fighting. But this time, they were on the offensive. The end. He stopped at the edge of town, looking for a ride. The nearest airport wasn't far, and getting to Frankfurt wasn't the hard part. It was what he'd find waiting for him that had Reacher on edge. He stood there for a few minutes, his eyes scanning the horizon until an old truck pulled up beside him. "You need a lift?" The driver, an older man in a baseball cap, leaned out the window. Reacher nodded, tossing his duffel in the back before climbing into the passenger seat. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the road toward the small regional airport. As they drove, Reacher's mind worked through the details. Burns wasn't the kind of man to send a distress signal lightly. Whatever he was caught up in now, it was big. And if he was using the old code system, it meant Burns was trying to stay off the grid. No paper trail, no digital footprints. The kind of operation Reacher was all too familiar with. The drive was short, and within an hour, Reacher was at the airport, booking a last-minute ticket to Frankfurt. He knew he could make calls, try to get more information, but that wasn't how he operated. He preferred to see things up close, get a feel for the situation himself. As he waited to board, he pulled out the phone again and reread the message. Burns' words had been brief but clear: in danger. Code 21984. Remember Frankfurt. It was a direct line into their shared history, and it sent Reacher's mind spiraling back to those days in Europe. There were people there, powerful people, who hadn't wanted their mission to succeed. And now, after all this time, Reacher couldn't shake the feeling that some of those same people might be pulling strings again. Hours later, Reacher stepped off the plane onto German soil. The air was different here, cooler, with the faint smell of jet fuel lingering in the background. The last time he'd been in Frankfurt, he'd left with more questions than answers. And now, it looked like he was back for round 2. He passed through customs without any issues, just another nameless traveler blending into the crowd. He didn't carry much with him, but he didn't need to. His mind was his greatest weapon, honed by years of instinct and experience. As he exited the airport, the bustling city lay before him, its skyline a mix of old-world architecture and modern steel. Somewhere in this city, Burns was either in hiding or caught in something bigger than either of them had anticipated. Reacher took a deep breath. The hunt had begun. He started by heading to a place he knew well, a small bar near the military base where soldiers used to unwind after long missions. If Burns was still in Frankfurt, someone there might know. The walk through the city streets was filled with memories, shadows of old comrades, the echo of boots on cobblestones, the cold efficiency of operations that blurred the line between right and wrong. Reacher didn't flinch from those memories. He welcomed them. They sharpened his focus, reminded him that the past never truly stayed buried. And whatever Burns had uncovered, Reacher knew it would lead them both back into the darkness they thought they'd escaped. The bar was still there, tucked into a side street, looking just as rundown as before. Reacher stepped inside, and the familiar smells of cigarette smoke and stale beer hit him like a wave of nostalgia. He moved to the back, where he could keep an eye on the door, and ordered a drink. It wasn't long before a man approached him, one of the few left from those days. Reacher didn't need to say much. Just a name. Burns. The man's expression shifted instantly. Reacher could see it in his eyes, worry, maybe even fear. That was all the confirmation he needed. Burns came through here a few days ago, the man said in a low voice, glancing around the room. He didn't stay long. Said he was being followed. Reacher leaned forward. By who? The man shrugged, but his face was pale. He didn't say. But if Burns is running, it's bad, Reacher. Real bad. Reacher nodded, downed the rest of his drink, and stood. He knew what he had to do. Burns was out there, somewhere in the city, and whoever was chasing him wouldn't stop until they found him. And now, Reacher was in the middle of it. Want to find out what happens next? Subscribe and share to follow Jack Reacher's thrilling journey as he dives deeper into the forgotten code. Chapter 3. Hidden Shadows. Frankfurt streets were as Reacher remembered, busy, layered with history, and full of secrets hiding in plain sight. The city had a rhythm, a constant hum that made it feel alive, but beneath that hum, Reacher could sense something darker. He could always feel it when things were about to turn. And now, that sensation was gnawing at him. After leaving the bar, he moved quickly through the city, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Burns had been here, just days ago, and now he was in hiding. Whoever was after him was likely watching, tracking his every move. Reacher knew the drill. He'd been on both sides of the chase before. He headed toward an older part of the city, where the buildings were closer together and the alleys twisted like a labyrinth. Burns had always been good at disappearing, but Reacher had a hunch about where to start looking. There was a safe house not far from the river, a place they'd used during past operations. It was off the grid, forgotten by most, but if Burns was desperate, he might have gone there. The streets narrowed as Reacher approached the area. The sun had set, and the night air was crisp, carrying with it the faint smell of the river. The lights from the buildings cast long shadows, making the alleys feel even more claustrophobic. Reacher's instincts kicked into high gear. This was the kind of place where danger thrived. He moved quietly, every step calculated. The safe house was tucked behind a row of old buildings, barely visible from the street. As he approached, he saw the faintest glow from a window on the second floor. His pulse quickened. Someone was inside. Reacher scanned the surroundings. No movement, no signs of surveillance. But he knew better than to let his guard down. He approached the back of the building, slipping through the shadows until he reached the entrance. The door was old, paint peeling, but locked. That was a good sign. It meant whoever was inside hadn't been careless. With a quick twist, Reacher picked the lock and stepped inside, his senses on high alert. The stairway creaked under his weight as he made his way up to the second floor. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening. A faint rustling from behind the door. He reached for the handle, twisted it slowly, and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a small lamp on the table. And there, sitting in the corner with a gun in hand, was Burns. He looked up, eyes wide with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Reacher," he breathed, lowering the weapon. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Reacher stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "What the hell is going on, Burns?" Burns stood, his movements stiff, like he hadn't slept in days. "I didn't know who else to call. They're after me, Reacher. I don't even know who they are anymore, but they're coming." Reacher's eyes narrowed. "Start from the beginning. What's this about? Why the code? Why Frankfurt?" Burns sank back into the chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "It's all tied to that mission. Frankfurt. Back then, we didn't know half of what was really happening. But now, I found something I wasn't supposed to. A name, buried in old files. Someone high up has been covering their tracks for years, and now they're cleaning house." Reacher stayed silent, letting Burns talk. He could see the fear in his old friend's eyes, but more than that, he saw the weariness. Burns had been running for a while now. "I was doing some freelance work," Burns continued, digging into old cases for private clients. "One of them led me back here, to Frankfurt, to that mission. I found records that were supposed to be sealed. And when I started asking questions, that's when the trouble started." Reacher's mind raced. Burns had stumbled onto something dangerous, something that connected to their past. And now, someone powerful wanted him silenced. "Who's behind it?" Reacher asked, his voice low. Burns shook his head. "I don't know exactly. But I've been followed, tracked. They're everywhere, Reacher. I can't trust anyone." Reacher glanced out the window. Burns was right. If this was as big as it sounded, then they weren't alone. Whoever was hunting Burns would stop at nothing to tie up loose ends. And now that Reacher was involved, he was a target too. Burns stood suddenly, pacing the room. "I thought I could handle it. But they're always one step ahead. They have resources, connections. I can't run anymore." Reacher watched him carefully. Burns was unraveling, and fast. But Reacher wasn't about to let his friend go down without a fight. "We need to find out who's pulling the strings," Reacher said. "There's always a trail, no matter how well they've covered it. And we'll follow it." Burns stopped, looking at Reacher with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You think we can beat them?" Reacher's eyes were cold, steady. "We're not beaten yet." At that moment, a noise outside the window caught their attention. Reacher moved to the edge, peeking through the curtain. Two figures, standing at the end of the alley. They weren't moving, just watching. "They've found us," Burns whispered, panic rising in his voice. Reacher's expression hardened. He turned to Burns. "Stay here. I'll handle this." Without another word, Reacher slipped out the door and into the night, ready to face whatever threat was lurking outside. He'd been in worse situations before, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding the truth before it was too late. And Reacher wasn't about to let anyone stop him. Curious to see what happens next? Subscribe and share to stay on the edge of your seat as the mystery of the forgotten code deepens. Chapter 4. Closing in. The cold night air hit Reacher's face as he stepped out of the building, slipping into the shadows with practiced ease. The figures at the end of the alley were still there, unmoving, their eyes locked on the entrance to the safe house. They hadn't seen him yet. Reacher knew how to move like a ghost when necessary. He crouched low, his eyes scanning the narrow alley for any sign of movement. The two men were dressed in dark clothing, blending into the night, but Reacher could make out the subtle bulge of weapons hidden under their jackets. They weren't amateurs. Whoever had sent them knew what they were doing. Reacher's mind raced through his options. Confronting them head-on was risky, they were likely armed, and the alley didn't leave much room for maneuvering. But he needed answers, and these men were his best shot at figuring out who was hunting Burns. He moved silently, sticking to the shadows as he crept closer to the men. His footsteps were soundless, his breathing controlled. Years of military training kicked in, every muscle in his body attuned to the danger. As he got closer, he could hear them talking in low voices, but he couldn't make out the words. When he was just a few feet away, Reacher struck. With lightning speed, he grabbed the nearest man by the throat, yanking him into the shadows. Before the second man could react, Reacher had already slammed the first one into the wall, knocking him out cold with a single blow. The second man turned, his hand reaching for his weapon, but Reacher was faster. He kicked the gun out of the man's hand and delivered a sharp punch to his gut, doubling him over in pain. The man gasped for air as Reacher pinned him against the wall, his arm pressed tightly across the man's throat. "Who sent you?" Reacher growled, his voice low and dangerous. The man struggled, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know," he stammered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We're just muscle. We get paid to follow orders, that's it." Reacher tightened his grip, his face inches from the man's. "What orders? Who are you after?" The man's eyes darted around, panic setting in. "The guy you're protecting. Burns. We were told to find him, keep an eye on him. That's all I know, I swear." Reacher narrowed his eyes, studying the man's face. He was scared, but he wasn't lying. These guys were just the tip of the iceberg, pawns in a much larger game. But someone had given them the order to track Burns, and that someone was still out there, pulling the strings. Reacher let go of the man's throat, letting him collapse to the ground, gasping for air. "Tell your boss that Burns is off limits," Reacher said coldly. "If they come after him again, I'll come after them." The man nodded frantically, scrambling to his feet and dragging his unconscious partner down the alley. Reacher watched them disappear into the darkness, his mind already working through the next steps. Whoever was behind this had deep pockets and enough influence to send professionals after Burns. They wouldn't stop just because Reacher had warned them off. In fact, now that they knew Reacher was involved, they might escalate their efforts. But that was a problem for later. For now, Reacher needed to get Burns out of Frankfurt. The city was too hot, and Burns wasn't in any condition to keep running. Reacher had seen the fear in his eyes, the paranoia that comes when you've been hunted for too long. Burns was unraveling, and Reacher knew they were running out of time. He slipped back into the safe house, finding Burns pacing the room, his face pale and drawn. "They're outside, aren't they?" Burns asked, his voice trembling. "Not anymore," Reacher said, locking the door behind him. "But they'll be back. We need to move." Burns nodded, but Reacher could see the doubt in his eyes. "Where can we go?" "They'll find me no matter where I hide." Reacher stepped closer, his voice steady. "We're not hiding. We're going to find out who's behind this, and we're going to stop them. But first, we need to get you out of the city." Burns swallowed hard, nodding again, though his hands shook. "Where do we go?" Reacher thought for a moment. They needed a place that was off the radar, somewhere Burns could lay low while Reacher worked to uncover the truth. There was one option, a safe house outside the city, deeper into the countryside. It was more remote, harder to track. Reacher had used it before, and no one else knew it existed. "We're heading north," Reacher said. "There's a place we can go. It's safe, but we need to leave now." Burns grabbed his jacket and followed Reacher out of the safe house. They moved quickly through the back streets, avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted. As they walked, Reacher's mind kept turning over the pieces of the puzzle. Whoever was after Burns wasn't just cleaning up loose ends from the Frankfurt mission. This was something bigger, an operation that had been in motion for years, kept in the shadows until Burns got too close. And now, Reacher had to figure out how deep it went before it swallowed them both. As they reached the edge of the city, the lights of Frankfurt faded behind them, and the open road stretched out ahead. The next few hours would be crucial. Reacher knew they were still being hunted, and it wouldn't take long for their pursuers to catch up. But as long as Reacher was on the case, they wouldn't get far. Excited to see how the chase unfolds? Subscribe and share to stay on the edge of your seat as the mystery of the forgotten code takes a thrilling turn. Chapter 5. The Safe House. The night stretched on as Reacher and Burns drove deeper into the countryside, the hum of the engine the only sound breaking the silence between them. Burns sat in the passenger seat, his eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror every few minutes, as if expecting someone to appear on their tail. Reacher remained focused, his hands steady on the wheel, navigating the narrow back roads with ease. They had left the city behind hours ago, the lights of Frankfurt a distant memory. The countryside was dark, quiet, with nothing but open fields and dense forests stretching out on either side of the road. It was the kind of place where you could disappear if you knew how to stay hidden. And that's exactly what Reacher intended to do, at least until he figured out who was pulling the strings behind this operation. Burns shifted in his seat, his voice breaking the silence. "How much further?" "Not long now," Reacher replied, his eyes scanning the road ahead. "The place is remote. They won't find us easily." Burns nodded, but the tension in his face didn't ease. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, haunted by whatever secrets he had uncovered. Reacher could see the weight of those secrets wearing him down. Burns wasn't the same soldier Reacher had known all those years ago. This was a man on the edge. After another 20 minutes of driving, Reacher turned down a narrow dirt road, barely visible in the moonlight. It wound through a dense patch of trees, leading them deeper into the forest. The branches above formed a canopy, blocking out most of the night sky, and the headlights barely cut through the darkness. Finally, they arrived. The safe house was a small, nondescript cabin hidden among the trees. It had been abandoned for years, but Reacher had kept it in the back of his mind, a place to go when there was no other option. The cabin had no electricity, no modern comforts, but it was secluded, and that was all that mattered now. Reacher parked the car behind the cabin, out of sight from the road. They both stepped out, the cool night air biting against their skin. Burns looked around nervously, his breath visible in the chill. "This place, are you sure it's safe?" Burns asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Reacher didn't answer right away. He walked to the front door, pushed it open, and stepped inside. The interior was sparse, just as he remembered: old furniture, dusty shelves, and a faint smell of wood and earth. It wasn't much, but it was secure. As safe as it gets, Reacher finally said, motioning for Burns to follow him inside. Burns stepped in cautiously, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. Reacher moved quickly, checking the windows and locking the door behind them. Every movement was precise, methodical. He had done this countless times before, assessing threats, securing positions, preparing for whatever might come next. Once the cabin was secured, Reacher turned to Burns. "You're going to stay here. No calls, no outside contact. If anyone's watching, they won't find you here. I'll be back soon." Burns frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Where are you going?" "I need to find out who's after you," Reacher said, grabbing a map from the shelf. He spread it out on the table, marking a location several miles away. "There's a town not far from here. If they're looking for you, someone there will know." Burns looked at the map, then back at Reacher. "You think they'll stop coming? Even if we hide out here?" Reacher met his gaze, his expression hard. "No. But if we find out who's pulling the strings, we can stop them before they get to us." Burns sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want any of this, you know? I thought I was just looking at old files, digging up some history. I didn't realize what I was getting into." Reacher leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "That's how it always starts. But now we're in it, and we have to see it through." For a moment, silence hung between them. Burns looked like he wanted to say more, but the weight of his situation had worn him down. Reacher could see it in his eyes, the doubt, the fear. But there was something else there too. A flicker of hope, buried deep beneath the exhaustion. Reacher checked his watch. "I'll be gone a few hours. Stay inside, keep the doors locked. If anything happens, anything, you don't wait. You get out the back and keep moving." "Understood." Burns nodded slowly. "Yeah, I got it." Reacher gave him one last look, then grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. As he stepped outside, the night air felt colder than before, the forest around them eerily quiet. He moved quickly to the car, keeping his footsteps light on the gravel. The road ahead was dangerous, and Reacher knew he'd be facing more than just hired guns this time. The men after Burns were part of something much larger, much more organized. They had resources, they had connections, and they weren't going to stop until they silenced Burns for good. But Reacher wasn't the kind of man who backed down from a fight, especially when the odds were against him. As he drove away from the cabin, the headlights cutting through the dark forest, Reacher's mind turned over the possibilities. He had leads to follow, questions that needed answers. And the deeper he dug, the closer he'd get to the truth. One way or another, the hunt was just beginning. Are you ready for the next twist? Subscribe and share to stay on the edge of your seat as Jack Reacher delves deeper into the forgotten code. Chapter 6. The Hunter's Trap. The road stretched long and dark ahead of Reacher, the car's headlights cutting through the dense forest as he made his way toward the nearby town. Every mile felt heavier, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. Burns had given him pieces of the puzzle, but the whole picture was still buried deep, hidden in shadows of the past. Whoever was hunting Burns wasn't going to stop, and Reacher needed to find out why. The small town emerged in the distance, its few streetlights casting dim halos over the quiet streets. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and outsiders were noticed quickly. Reacher knew he had to be careful. If Burns' pursuers had ties to this place, they'd know he was coming. And if they were watching, Reacher needed to make his move before they did. He parked the car on the outskirts of town, walking the rest of the way. His footsteps were slow and deliberate as he made his way toward the only place that still had its lights on, an old pub, tucked into the corner of the main street. The kind of place where people talked, where secrets leaked out over cheap beer and whispered conversations. Reacher stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking under his boots as he made his way to the bar. The place was mostly empty, save for a few locals nursing drinks in the corners. The bartender, A heavy-set man with a thick mustache eyed Reacher warily as he approached. "Just passing through?" the bartender asked, his voice gruff, but not unfriendly. Reacher nodded. "Looking for some information?" The bartender raised an eyebrow. "That so? What kind of information?" Reacher leaned in slightly, keeping his voice low. "A couple of guys came through here recently. Foreign, well-dressed, looking for someone. I'm guessing they didn't fit in with the usual crowd." The bartender's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he said nothing, just wiped the counter with a rag. Reacher could see the gears turning in his head, weighing whether to answer or not. "Maybe I've seen M," the bartender said after a long pause. "Maybe I haven't." Reacher didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a couple of bills and sliding them across the counter. "I'm betting you did." The bartender glanced down at the money, then back at Reacher. He let out a heavy sigh and pocketed the cash. "Yeah, they were here. Two guys, real sharp. Didn't talk much, but they were asking about someone, an American. Sounded like they were looking to collect on a debt, if you know what I mean." Reacher's jaw tightened. "When?" "Couple of nights ago," the bartender said. "They didn't stay long. Looked like they were in a hurry." Reacher nodded, piecing it together. Whoever was after Burns was closing in, and fast. They were professionals, likely part of a bigger operation that had the resources to track him anywhere. If they had been here, they knew Burns wasn't far. "Thanks," Reacher said, turning to leave. "Hey," the bartender called out, stopping him. "Word of advice, if you're tangled up with those guys, be careful. They're not the kind that just walk away." Reacher gave a nod of acknowledgement, pushing open the door and stepping back into the cold night air. He glanced around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, but Reacher's instincts told him something was off. He'd been followed before, hunted by men who knew how to blend into the shadows, and now, that familiar feeling was creeping back. He crossed the street, sticking close to the buildings, keeping to the darkest parts of the road. His eyes scanned every corner, every window. If they were watching him, they'd already know where he was. Halfway down the street, Reacher heard the faintest rustle behind him, footsteps, quickly masked by the night. He didn't turn, didn't react, but his senses were on full alert now. Whoever was following him was good, but not good enough. Reacher could feel the tension in the air, the way the shadows seemed to shift around him. At the end of the street, Reacher slipped into a narrow alley, moving quickly but quietly. The footsteps followed. He could hear them now, closer, trying to stay hidden but failing to escape his sharp instincts. Reacher stepped into a recessed doorway, pressing himself against the wall, waiting. The footsteps approached, slow, deliberate. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. Reacher's muscles tensed, his eyes narrowing as he waited for the perfect moment. The shadow of a man fell across the alleyway, and just as he passed by the doorway, Reacher struck. With a lightning-fast move, he grabbed the man from behind, twisting his arm and slamming him against the wall. The man grunted in pain, but before he could reach for his weapon, Reacher disarmed him, tossing the gun into the alley. "Who sent you?" Reacher growled, his grip tightening around the man's throat. The man struggled, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "You've got it all wrong." Reacher shoved him harder against the wall. "Wrong answer." The man coughed, his eyes wide with panic. I'm just supposed to follow you, keep an eye on you. I don't know anything else, I swear." Reacher studied the man's face, searching for any sign of a lie. His instincts told him this guy wasn't a threat, just another pawn in the game. He loosened his grip slightly. "Who hired you?" The man hesitated, then finally spoke. "I don't know his name. I get orders through a third party. All I know is they want the American. Burns." Reacher's jaw clenched. It was clear now, whoever was after Burns wasn't just cleaning up loose ends. They were orchestrating a hunt, tracking every move, and now Reacher was in their sights too. He let the men go, stepping back into the shadows. Tell them they've got one chance to back off. If they don't, I'll come for them. The men nodded frantically, backing away before disappearing down the alley. Reacher stood there for a moment, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture was still blurred. Burns had uncovered something big, something that connected their past to this present danger. And now, Reacher was in the middle of it. He knew one thing for sure, there was no turning back. Not now. Not with men in the shadows, pulling strings from the darkness. The only question was how deep the conspiracy went. And Reacher was going to find out, no matter what it took. Can't wait to see what Reacher uncovers next? Subscribe and share to keep following the relentless hunt in the Forgotten Code. Chapter 7. The Web Tightens. Reacher stood in the alley for a moment longer, his mind racing. Whoever was orchestrating this hunt was good, methodical, well-funded, and always a step ahead. But now, Reacher had rattled the cage. They knew he was involved, and they would tighten their grip. That meant Burns was running out of time. He moved swiftly back toward his car, keeping to the shadows. The town was still eerily quiet, but Reacher's senses were on high alert. There was no doubt in his mind that more eyes were on him now, watching, waiting to see his next move. When he reached the car, he slipped into the driver's seat and pulled out the map again. He needed to get back to Burns, and fast. The safe house was hidden deep in the forest, but if their pursuers had already followed them this far, it was only a matter of time before they found it. Reacher fired up the engine and sped out of town, the narrow road winding through the dark forest. As the car cut through the night, his mind pieced together the puzzle. Burns had uncovered something in those old files, something that had been buried for years. And whatever it was connected to their mission in Frankfurt, something neither of them had fully understood back then. Now, those same shadows were reaching out to silence them both. His phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. Reacher glanced at the screen, a message from a number he didn't recognize. The text was short and to the point. "You're in over your head, Reacher. Walk away before it's too late." Reacher's jaw tightened. Threats didn't intimidate him, they never had. But this was different. Whoever sent the message knew his name, knew what he was doing. And they were watching. He tapped out a response, keeping it just as brief. "Come and stop me." The phone stayed silent after that, but Reacher knew the message had been received. He tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and focused on the road ahead. The safe house wasn't far now, but the sense of urgency gnawed at him. If Burns had been found before Reacher got there, it would be too late. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees as Reacher drove deeper into the forest. The safe house appeared suddenly, tucked away among the tall pines, its dark silhouette barely visible against the night sky. Reacher parked the car a short distance away, walking the rest of the way in silence. Every step was measured, every sound in the forest amplified. When he reached the door, something felt wrong. The air was too still, too quiet. Reacher's hand hovered over the doorknob, his senses screaming at him to stay alert. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Reacher's eyes scanned the space, his instincts on high alert. The cabin was exactly as he had left it, except for one thing. Burns was gone. Reacher's pulse quickened, but his mind stayed calm. He moved quickly through the cabin, checking every corner, every possible hiding spot. Burns wasn't there. The back door was slightly ajar, and Reacher's stomach sank. He stepped outside, his eyes immediately drawn to the dark woods surrounding the cabin. If Burns had fled, there was a chance he had gone into the forest. But there was no telling how long ago he had left, or if he had been taken. Reacher crouched by the door, his eyes narrowing as he examined the ground. Faint footprints led away from the cabin, disappearing into the underbrush. They were fresh, He followed the tracks, his pace quick but cautious. The forest was dense, the moonlight barely penetrating through the thick canopy, but Reacher moved with purpose. He had been in situations like this before, searching for a mun in the dark, not knowing whether he was the hunter or the hunted. The footprints led deeper into the woods, winding through trees and over uneven ground. Reacher's muscles tensed as he moved, every sound in the forest amplified in the stillness. He could feel the danger closing in, but he kept moving, driven by the need to find Burns before it was too late. Suddenly, a sound, a rustle in the bushes up ahead. Reacher froze, his ears straining to catch the faintest noise. The forest was silent again, but the sense of being watched was unmistakable. He moved closer, slipping behind a large tree for cover. There, just ahead, he saw movement. A figure, crouched low in the underbrush. Reacher's pulse quickened, but he kept his breathing steady. He edged closer, careful not to make a sound. The figure was alone, focused on something in the distance. Reacher could see the glint of a weapon in the moonlight. One of them. Reacher moved fast, closing the distance between them in a matter of seconds. Before the men could react, Reacher had him pinned against the ground, the cold metal of a knife pressed against his throat. "Where's Burns?" Reacher growled, his voice low and deadly. The man gasped for air, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know," he stammered. "I was just following orders. We were told to watch the cabin, nothing more." Reacher pressed the blade closer, his patience thin. "Who gave the orders?" "I don't know his name," the man choked out, panic setting in. "We get instructions from a handler. That's all I know, I swear." Reacher's grip tightened for a moment longer, then he let the man go, shoving him back into the underbrush. The man scrambled to his feet and took off running into the woods, disappearing into the night. Reacher stood there, his mind racing. The trap had been set, and now they were tightening the noose. Burns was still out there, somewhere in the forest, and the men hunting him weren't far behind. Reacher knew time was running out. If he didn't find Burns soon, the next time he saw him might be too late. He turned back toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the dark forest around him. The web was tightening, and whoever was pulling the strings was about to reveal themselves. Reacher wasn't afraid of the trap. He was just waiting for the right moment to spring it. And when he did, the hunters would realize too late that they had underestimated their prey. Eager to see how Reacher turns the tables? Subscribe and share to stay with him as the hunt intensifies in the Forgotten Code. Chapter 8. Final Reckoning. The forest seemed to grow darker as Reacher made his way back toward the cabin, the weight of the hunt pressing down on him. Burns was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, and Reacher knew the men pursuing him weren't far behind. The air was thick with the tension of what was to come, a final confrontation, and this time, it wouldn't end quietly. Reacher approached the cabin cautiously, every instinct on high alert. Something was different now. The stillness in the air felt too heavy, like the calm before a storm. He moved quickly, scanning the perimeter, looking for any sign of Burns or their pursuers. Then, he saw it. A faint glimmer of movement near the tree lean, another figure, lurking in the shadows, watching. Reacher's pulse quickened. He wasn't alone. He circled around the cabin, keeping low, his eyes trained on the figure. As he got closer, he realized this wasn't one of the hired guns. The posture, the way the man held himself, was different. Reacher's breath caught for a moment. Burns. Reacher stepped out from the shadows, moving toward his old friend. Burns turned, startled, but when he saw Reacher, a wave of relief washed over his face. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, his clothes disheveled from days of running. "Reacher," Burns breathed, his voice strained. "I didn't know if you'd make it back." Reacher nodded, stepping closer. "I'm here. But we don't have much time. They've set a trap, and they're closing in." Burns ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of fear and frustration. I tried to disappear, but they kept finding me. No matter where I went, they were always one step ahead. Reacher's mind raced, piecing it all together. They've been tracking you. Not just physically, they're using resources we don't even know about. Surveillance, contacts, it's bigger than we thought. Burns nodded, his eyes darting nervously to the dark forest around them. I should have known. I didn't realize what I was uncovering until it was too late. And now, they won't stop until I'm gone. Reacher stepped closer, his voice steady. What did you find, Burns? Why is this so important? Burns hesitated, his hand trembling slightly. It was the Frankfurt mission, the files I found. Back then, we thought it was just a standard op, clean up after a failed mission, tie up loose ends. But it was more than that. There was a name buried in those files, someone high up, pulling strings. They were running black ops without oversight, using us as pawns. And when I started asking questions, that's when they came after me. Reacher's jaw tightened. The pieces clicked into place. Burns had uncovered something dangerous, something that connected to powerful people who couldn't afford to be exposed. And now, they were silencing anyone who got too close. They're cleaning house, Reacher said, his voice low. And they're not going to stop until you're dead. Burns nodded, his face pale. I didn't know who else to turn to, Reacher. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong. Reacher's mind raced, weighing their options. They couldn't stay here, the men hunting them were already closing in, and it was only a matter of time before they found the cabin. They needed to move, fast, but the odds were stacked against them. Come on, Reacher said, turning toward the car. We need to get out of here. But before they could move, a voice echoed through the darkness. Going somewhere, gentlemen? Reacher froze, his eyes narrowing as the figure stepped out from the shadows. The man was tall, well-dressed, with an air of cold authority. His hands were empty, but Reacher could see the subtle bulge of a concealed weapon under his coat. This wasn't just a hired gun, this was the man in charge. Behind him, two more men emerged from the trees, their weapons drawn. They moved with precision, their eyes locked on Reacher and Burns. You've caused quite a bit of trouble, Reacher, the men said, his voice smooth and calm. And you, Burns, digging where you shouldn't have. Now, it's time to put an end to this. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.